Everyone, how are you doing today? It's good to see I actually see some familiar names here in the little prompt, so it's nice to see some of you guys again. And as Paul mentioned, so we're going to be talking a little bit about pollinators today. So what I wanted to do is get started and just introduce you to that sort of term, pollination, introduce myself, and then we're going to take a look at some of the butterflies that we have here in our butterfly exhibit, which, as hopefully a lot of us know, are important pollinators in their own right. So give me 1 second just to share my screen here. So anyway, so my name is Jeffry Petracca. I am the curator of entomology at the Long Island Aquarium in Riverhead. So if any of you guys have ever been here before, I basically live in our butterfly exhibit in our insect zoo, and I take care of exotic insects and spiders from around the world. And I've been studying insects basically my entire life. I'm also an educator at the DNA Learning Center in Cold Spring Harbor, which is essentially an outreach center for molecular biology for both middle school, high school, and even actually undergraduate students. Okay, so I really enjoy education, and I'm actually nearly a master's in biochemistry now, and I like chemistry, I like science in general, but insects have always been very close to my heart, and butterflies in particular are one of those things that I think I've pretty much grown up with my entire life. So this is going to be very much my life here that you guys are seeing. All right. So the purpose of today's talk is basically going to be talking a little bit about what pollination is, talking about what types of pollinators are out there, and with a focus, of course, on butterflies and bees, and then also giving you some tips essentially on how to start your own pollinator garden in your yard, and what you can do to sort of entice them into your yard or keep them around if you already have them. Okay. So first thing that I want to talk about, and also, by the way, guys, I'm very interactive when I do these virtual discussions. I think we all, a lot of us anyway, have gotten used to this Zoom, these Zoom meetings in the last year. But I like to be very interactive. So if you wouldn't mind, you can unmute yourselves if you want to answer a question. You can raise your hand using the little raise hand chat feature, or you could just honestly throw answers and responses into the chat, whatever you feel comfortable with. And so I'm going to actually start there by saying, what is pollination? So can anyone give me like a definition of what that might be? What do we mean by pollination, that term? Okay, someone said spreading seeds. Is that pollination? What do you guys think? Anyone else want to wager a guess? Take a guess at that term? What does it mean to pollinate?
To make something reproduce?
Okay, to make something reproduce. I see in the chat, Ada said spreading pollen. So yes, both of those are correct. To reproduce is actually not quite as correct because of what pollination actually means, but we'll talk about why in a second. Pollination means a very specific thing. Fertilize a flower to make seeds. Good, Sam, I'm glad you said that. So actually fertilization is actually different than pollination. Just to throw that out there. So fertilizing a flower is actually different than pollinating. We like to say that, you know, when a flower gets fertilized, or when a pollen grain actually delivers its package of genetic material to an egg cell that's in a flower, we like to say that those two terms are the same thing, pollination, fertilization, but they're actually not the same thing. So I'm going to go with the spreading pollen definition, because that's really what pollination is. So at a very basic level, pollination is essentially to bring pollen from one flower and bring it to another, essentially. That's the definition, very simply. That doesn't necessarily mean that that pollen grain is going to successfully fertilize that flower. It just means that pollen goes from one place to another, one flower to another, I should say, and that's it. So with that being said, if we take a look at our sort of picture here on the slides, you notice this is like a meadow, right? And basically there's a whole bunch of different flowers in this meadow. You have what looks like some sort of sage. You have these you have these like daisy looking things over here. And what those are essentially billboards. Okay, so a long time ago, I basically learned about flower biology in one of the classes I took as an undergrad. And it was described to me as, like, when you look at a meadow as a pollinator, it's the equivalent of us walking into Times Square in New York City. So think about that. Like when you walk into Times Square, what do you notice? You notice there's a bunch of billboards, there's a bunch of signs everywhere advertising products. And those signs are meant to make you essentially go to one particular store or one particular company and buy their product, right? So this meadow is exactly the same thing for a pollinator. Each one of these flowers is essentially a billboard communicating the, I guess you could say, the tastiness or the nutritional quality of the reward that those flowers will give to a potential pollinator, like an insect. Okay, so there are a couple different things at play here, though. So a flower needs to fertilize other flowers. It needs to essentially make seeds and spread itself around the environment, right? Flowers, though, don't really move around too much. They basically are rooted in the ground wherever they may have started to grow, and that's pretty much it. So what they have to do is rely on things like pollinators, basically organisms that visit those flowers to bring their pollen, their genetic material, from one flower to another. In order to entice them to do that, however, they need to give them some sort of reward in return. And that's where this term nectar comes into play. So nectar essentially is like a sweet reward present in the cup of a flower that a pollinator will essentially be looking for to eat. And in the process, it will get covered in pollen, and then it will, just by random chance, bring that pollen from one flower to another. Okay, so that's the idea. And so with that in mind, when we talk about pollination, flower structure is super, super important. It literally is everything when we're talking about pollination. Now, you might look at a flower, as I basically once did, and I would just say, like, they're just these pretty like things that sit out in the environment. They're pretty cool looking, and that's it. But they're actually really intensely structured, and there's some intense biology going on. So let's break that down for a little bit. So let's look at a flower. So all flowers have the same basic components. There's 4 components to a flower, actually. At the very base, at the very central center of a flower, we have the female part. So right here, this little long thing in the slides here, this is called a pistil. Okay, so a pistil is, or a carpel is another name for it. A carpel is essentially the female part of a flower. And it looks like a little, almost like turkey baster, kind of. It has this little tip up here, a sticky part, and then it has this long, that's called the stigma, right over here. It has this long part here called the style, and then at the bottom it has this little thing that almost looks like a piece of fruit. That is the ovary. And an ovary might have many different compartments which contain egg cells. Those compartments are called ovules. Okay, so that's the female part of the flower. That's at the center of the flower. The next sort of layer of morphology surrounding that carpel are these little squiggly things coming out here. Those are called the stamens. Okay, stamens are the male part of a flower. Stamens produce pollen. Pollen is produced right up here at these things, these little blue things in the picture here. Those are called anthers. And in that little blue thing, there's a whole bunch of pollen grains, probably thousands and thousands and thousands in a single anther component up here. But those are the 2 reproductive parts of the flower. So we have the female part, then we have the male part. The next layer of structure in a flower are the petals. So petals are the things that we're most familiar with, I think, when we look at flowers. They are essentially these brightly colored, essentially, these are the billboards, more or less, for the flower. Those are the things that have these bright colors in order to lure pollinators to them and communicate, again, that nectar reward that may be contained within the flower itself. And so the last part of a flower are the sepals. And the sepals are typically, not always, green things or sort of not colorful things sitting around the edges of a row of petals, of a ring of petals, I should say, a whorl of petals. Okay, and those are the 4 components of a flower. Every different flower has either all 4 of those things, or it's missing maybe 1 or 2 of those things. They're greatly reduced. Okay, so it depends on the specific type of plant that we're talking about, or even the cultivar or plant that we're talking about. And like sometimes there are male flowers, sometimes there are female flowers that have only one of either the stamen or the carpel, and other times they have both, like in the picture here. So there are flowers that will have both of these things as well. Okay, so the nectary, the thing that essentially holds the nectar, presentation a number of times throughout the presentation today, just because I feel like they're so important. This is a leafcutter bee, which are pretty cool. We actually have those on Long Island. Leafcutter bees actually cut leaves from the environment and use them to line their burrows, which they dig into the ground. And last but not least, in the right, we have a longhorn bee. These are also ground-dwelling bees. And you can see that this guy's covered, or I should say gal, is actually covered in a whole bunch of pollen. So what winds up happening is a pollinator will see this message on a petal and say, wow, that's an awesome flower. I'm gonna go visit that and get some nectar, really, really good nectar. And when the pollinator sticks his little head or her, and the pollen just jostles off and gets stuck to them. And once they take that nectar, they're gonna go off and visit another flower. And in the process, they accidentally essentially transport pollen from one place to another. And that's the idea. That's what pollination actually is. Okay, so here we have a couple of different types of pollination. So here's some insect pollination. And again, it's essentially describing the same thing that I was talking about. So here we have a butterfly. The butterfly has to get to the nectary, which is all the way deep down in the bottom of the flower. And then in the process, he's gonna get covered in pollen. Same thing here for the bee. The bee goes down into this flower, into this lily, I guess it's supposed to be, and he might get covered in pollen. Although this is a weird flower because notice that the anthers are way up here. So chances are he might not get covered. This might not be the best pollinator essentially for this flower just because he's got to stick his body way down deep into the flower. And so that's what I'm talking about when I say structure. So when you look at a flower, look very carefully at where the bottom of that flower starts and where the anthers, where the male parts are and where the female parts are, because very often they're adapted to a specific type of pollinator relationship, or even a specific type of pollination. Insects aren't the only things that pollinate. After all, many plants are actually wind pollinated. And what that means is essentially like up here in the top left over here, we have grass flowers that will essentially flower and then they produce pollen. And then that pollen literally just flies off in the wind and gets carried to other grass flowers. That doesn't need a pollinator to help it out. There also are flowers that don't need pollinators in that they can just simply pollinate themselves. So we have some flowers, like maybe that lily up there, that will drop pollen off of it. It'll land on the little sticky stigma up here on the top of the carpel, and then that will essentially be able to self-pollinate itself. Same thing can happen when we have male and female parts on two different flowers, or on the same plant, or two different, like male and female flowers on two completely different plants. So all of those different options are possible. And then of course we have human artificial pollination, which basically entails you essentially taking like a little fine paintbrush, taking the pollen off of the anther and sticking it to the stigma in the hopes of trying to pollinate that flower. So now, fertilization. Fertilization is a little bit different. So what winds up happening when a pollen grain lands on a stigma is a pollen grain essentially has two different cells inside of it. That's it, believe it or not. There's only two cells that make up a pollen grain, or at least the inside of the pollen grain. There's what's called a pollen tube forming cell and a sperm cell. And a sperm cell, as hopefully many of us know, is basically a male gamete. It's a, a male quote unquote gamete. And it's essentially the gamete that has to unite with the egg, right? So the eggs are way down here in the ovary, well, actually an ovule of the carpel, right down here. So what winds up happening is a pollen grain lands on the surface of the stigma, and when it's there, it actually recognizes specific proteins on the outside of the stigma, as well as specific proteins on the outside of the pollen grain. The interaction of those two proteins essentially say to the pollen grain, hey, you're on top of a stigma of your particular plant. Time to get the party started here. So what winds up happening is the pollen tube forming cell will start essentially growing and start cutting away through the down the style here, down deep into the ovary of a plant. I don't know why I keep saying ovary, I'm sorry. And then once that path is carved out through the style, a sperm cell will divide into two. So it actually mitotically divides into two cells, and those cells basically travel way down the little highway that's created, this little pollen tube, and it goes right into the ovary and fertilizes the egg. Okay, and that's the idea. That's what fertilization is. But notice that sometimes these pollen grains don't actually successfully produce a pollen tube. So these, I think, are meant to represent growing pollen tubes. But in some cases, what winds up happening is the mother plant here, the carpel of this plant, recognizes that pollen grain using a specific set of, again, protein receptors on the outside of that pollen grain, and it says, whoa, 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 this flower, this pollen grain is actually my own pollen. I don't want that pollen because I don't want to self-pollinate myself. And so what it'll actually do is it will abort that pollination event and cause it to not be successful. And that can happen just by random chance as well. So basically, if your pollen tube does not successfully go all the way down to the ovary here, it will not be a successful fertilization. It will not lead to a successful fertilization. Okay, so this is all representative of pollination, but this is the only thing, this path right here is the only thing representative of fertilization. Okay, so once a successful fertilization happens, what winds up after that is you have the formation of seeds. Okay, so here we have a tomato flower on the left-hand side here. Notice it's upside down, it's sort of dangling, right? If you've grown tomatoes at home, hopefully you've seen that. And does anyone know what pollinates tomatoes? Why that flower is upside down like that? It's okay if you don't. I'm just curious if anyone's ever really thought about this when you think about growing tomatoes. A lot of people grow tomatoes. So I figured maybe someone had noticed what goes on. Okay, so what winds up happening is when your pollen grain, when your tomato plant, your flower is sort of dangling down, the intended pollinator for this type of flower is actually a bumblebee or some type of bee. They're actually the most efficient pollinators of many of the plants in the Solanaceae because they do something called buzz pollination. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but they're the best ones at essentially pulling pollen off of this flower, and they'll bring it to another. So once pollination happens, and then once a fertilization event happens, that flower, the entirety of that flower will develop into a fruit. And a fruit is basically just a plant ovary. Not to be gross, but this is like botany 101. Fruits are plant ovaries. And so when you're eating a fruit, you're actually eating the fleshy part of the ovary, which is intended for things like birds and mammals. Okay, so basically this fruit, the petals all fall away, the sepals remain, but even the carpel and the stamens will wind up sort of reducing. So that little sort of doodle on the bottom of a tomato winds up, it's actually the shriveled male and female parts of the flower. And then inside, what winds up happening is the ovules, each individual compartment within the ovary winds up developing into what we know as a tomato, what we're familiar with when we cut into or slice into a tomato. And this fruit is bright red because that color is very enticing to other animals, larger animals, such as birds or squirrels or something like that. And here we have a little bird. I'm not familiar with birds. I don't know what kind of bird it is, but he's eating berries, right? And he's going to eat those berries. Those seeds that are inside of that berry, which a berry is just a type of fruit, will essentially pass through that bird's digestive system, pass through his gut, and then he'll poop it out somewhere. So he is actually really good at seed dispersal. Insects, not so much, right? Insects are a little small. They're not going to be able to pick up a seed and carry it away and drop it somewhere, although that's not always the case. But usually mammals and birds are much better at seed dispersal than insects are. Yes, exactly. Fruit tastes really good so that it can be spread. And usually for humans, it's a little weird, right? Because we like to eat sometimes fruits that I don't think are supposed to taste good to us. But like if you think about it, when you're eating, like, let's say a banana even, you want to wait till that banana is really ripe, right? Actually, a banana is a bad example because you don't really see seeds in there. But think of like a mango or an avocado, right? Avocados are fruits as well. By the way, I'm a purist when it comes to botany. Like a fruit is a fruit to me. A fruit is basically a plant ovary. So even a peanut is actually a fruit. A walnut, an acorn, those are all simple fruits. So if you hear me say fruit when I'm talking about what we might think of as a nut, it's basically the same thing. Okay, so there's different varieties because again, they're intended for different types of seed dispersers. But think about a mango. So like if you try to eat a mango that's not ripe, it's usually not very good. But once that mango ripens, it gets sweeter and sweeter and sweeter, right? And then at some point, that becomes really enticing to a mammal, like a bird or something. Like think about the rainforest, right? Like parrots sitting up in the rainforest. All of a sudden, that green mango that wasn't very ripe starts turning redder, right? And then it becomes a little bit more enticing. That indicates to the bird that it is ready to go, it's ripe, and it's tasty. They're going to go ahead and eat that, and then they're going to wind up being able to, and that sort of ripening event coincides with the development of the seed. So basically, when a fruit is at its ripest, that's the best time to actually pull the seeds out of it and disperse them. Okay? Mango's a bad example, I guess, too, because mango, obviously, a parrot's not going to eat a whole mango seed. But like a mammal or something like that, like a big monkey or something might eat a mango seed, for instance. Okay? All right. So any questions so far on any of that? So one last slide, and then we're going to jump into I'm just going to show you the butterfly exhibit. So let's back up a little bit to pollination. I hope that's all clear what the difference is between a pollination event and a fertilization event, and how pollinators differ from seed dispersers. So they're two different events, right? Insects are really, really good. In fact, they're unparalleled when it comes to pollination. And not just the insects that we're typically familiar with. Like everybody pretty much, you know, when you talk about pollination, everybody's like, oh, butterflies and bees, right? They're the best pollinators out there, which is probably true. At least bees are definitely one of the best pollinators out there. But there are plenty of insects that don't get enough credit, and they're actually probably better pollinators than we would think they are. So for instance, flies. Flies are really, really good pollinators. Mosquitoes, for instance, we all hate mosquitoes, right? Everyone hates mosquitoes. So it turns out that the female mosquito is the only mosquito that actually bites humans. It sucks our blood to essentially nutrify its eggs and give them a little bit more nutrition to develop. However, when they're not ready to lay eggs, or even like the male mosquito, for instance, those guys will just visit flowers and they'll take pollen and nectar from those flowers and eat that. Beetles as well, they're another really important pollinator. So here we have the firefly. Fireflies are gonna, well, fireflies tend to be a little bit more on the predaceous side, some of them anyway. But this guy, they'll also actively go after pollen and nectar from flowers. Wasps as well. Wasps are super, super, super important pollinators. And when I say wasps, I don't necessarily just mean like yellow jackets or like this guy, I think is some type of paper wasp over here. But they are, yellow jackets aren't the best pollinators, but there are definitely some other bigger wasps that I think many of us would probably see and try to kill immediately. And really not a good idea to go after them. They're not going to attack you. They're not going to bother you. The only time that a yellow jacket or a wasp is going to go after you is if you literally go up to their nest and start hitting it, right? When their babies feel threatened, that's when they're going to go after them. Or if you chase the yellow jacket around and try to grab it, they're going to try to sting you. But in general, they're not going to go after you. Even that so-called Japanese murder hornet that everyone was talking about last year, they're not going to attack you unless you provoke them and they feel that their nest is threatened. So wasps, most of the time will be visiting flowers as adults to eat pollen and nectar, and then their babies will usually eat different types of insects. So yellow jackets, for instance, will actually go through your yard and they'll kill things like caterpillars and things like that. They bring them back to their nest, they chew them up, and then they spit them out to their babies, which live inside of the little cells in the yellow jacket's nest. And those guys, they're essentially like birds, more or less. That's what I like to think of them as. All right. Moths and butterflies, though, are definitely among the top pollinators, and that's specifically just because they really mostly rely on flower nectar for their main food source. Bees are definitely the best pollinators in terms of insects. They're one of the most successful and efficient pollinators out there. And yes, that is a hummingbird moth on the top right up here. So this slide is actually from the Xerces Society. This picture rather is from the Xerces Society, which is a conservation group. And so this is just basically their picture for all the pollinators, representative of pollinators that are out there. And so on the top right here, we have a moth that flies during the day. And this moth resembles a hummingbird. And so it flaps its wings really, really, really fast. It kind of flitters around just like a hummingbird. I don't know if any of you have seen them in your yard, but they're really, really cool. They're not altogether common on Long Island, but they are here, as are hummingbirds as well. So down here on the bottom right is a legit hummingbird. Those are, of course, also good pollinators because they're visiting flowers as well. And notice how in these images here, the different types of flowers that these pollinators are visiting. So flies, they're pretty small. They'll basically land on flowers that have a platform up on top. So I believe this is this possibly Queen Anne's lace over here, wild carrot. The hummingbird moth up here is visiting a butterfly bush. This is Buddleia. This is a tiger swallowtail visiting a milkweed flower. I don't know what that's supposed to be, but that's a bumblebee visiting he's basically, bumblebees, I always like to, they're kind of like the, they like to dive right into like as many flowers as possible. I always see them shoving their faces into flowers. Literally imagine like if you had a gigantic bowl of ice cream and you literally plopped yourself in the middle of it. That's what I picture bumblebees doing when they're visiting flowers. The Monarda down here, this is bee balm. Notice they have these little floral flutes coming off. Each one of these is a single flower, by the way. This whole thing represents what's called an inflorescence. So it's not a single flower, it's actually an inflorescence, many, many flowers. And each one of these flutes is specifically designed for things like butterflies or moths, because they are the only one, and hummingbirds, because they're the only ones with these long proboscises or beaks. That's what those little squiggly things are there, to fit deep down into the bottom of the flower. Okay, and so yeah, basically, in a roundabout way, what I'm saying is the structure of the flower is very much dependent on or I should say the structure of the flower is very much dependent on the interaction with a particular type of pollinator out there. So sunflowers, for instance, or basically anything in the aster family, they have that nice yellow spot in the middle and those little, what we always call petals around the outside of the flower. Turns out that a sunflower is an inflorescence. It's actually thousands of flowers representing many, many possible fruit-bearing components, fruit-bearing single florets or flowers. So if you think of like I don't know if you guys have ever seen a sunflower. When it goes to fruit or goes to seed, it'll produce all the little sunflowers right in the middle where all those sort of like darker black flowers are in the middle. And so each one of those represents a single flower. And those are actually called disc flowers, the little black ones that aren't very colorful in the center. The things on the edges, the petals that we typically call petals anyway, those are actually individual flowers as well. So each petal is actually a single flower. They call those ray flowers. And ray flowers are sterile. They do not produce any nectar or anything like that, or any pollen. The purpose of that flower is essentially, or the way that sunflowers and asters do it, is they essentially have these brightly colored sterile flowers around the edges, and it's almost like a directional, saying, hey, go to the middle here, that big black part in the center of the flower. There's a whole bunch of flowers in there. You'll have a bunch of nectar, a bunch of pollen. You'll be good to go if you visit there. That's essentially what the sunflower is doing. Okay, so without further ado, let me show you some of our pollinators here in action. Now, I had wanted to show you guys our beehive here at the aquarium. We just got this last year, but unfortunately, our bees are located right in our butterfly exhibit. So we have a nice little bee exhibit back here. That's where I'm standing right now. But unfortunately, the butterfly exhibit's a little warm. It's proved to be a little bit warm for them, and I believe they never actually went into their sort of hibernatory state. Usually this time of the year, beehives are going to start kind of calming down. All the bees will just sort of sit in one spot and they'll kind of hover around one another, and they don't really do too much moving. And that did not happen. They actually all left and went out to Riverhead, and you know, it was cold out there, so they didn't wind up coming back in. You could do the math. But so unfortunately, I don't really have much of the way of bees to show you today, which is sad because I really wanted to share that with you. But I do have plenty of butterflies at the very least. So here's our butterfly exhibit. Bear with me for the sort of shakiness of the camera here. I'm going to try to do this by hand. So our butterfly exhibit, I don't know if you guys have ever been here before, but we're filled with probably about 500 to 600 butterflies. Not much activity flying around in here today. I just watered, so everybody's kind of chilling on the plants right now. But what we do here is we essentially purchase our butterflies from all over the world. We get them shipped to us as chrysalises, the stage right before the adult butterfly, and then we let them out into the exhibit. And this is where you would be walking as a guest, essentially coming through the butterflies, and you have them essentially flying all around you. We're open year-round, and the profile of butterflies changes over the course of the year. So if you come one week, you might actually see a different assortment of butterflies than you will the following week. Now, if you notice, we have all these big bright lights in here, right? Those are 1,000-watt metal halide lights, they're called. They're actually coral lights. They're coral grow lights. And unfortunately, there's no natural light in here. So the plants that we have in here are pretty shaky. They don't do altogether well in here. They do well enough, considering that they're growing completely inside. This guy right here is one of my favorites. We just got these right before the pandemic. This is called Caesalpinia. It is an annual up here. It would not survive the weather up here, but take a look at that flower. So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about with flower structure. So if you look at that, notice that you have those brightly colored sections all around the edges. Those are petals. And if you take a look in here, there's actually one little stalk sticking out. I don't know if you guys can see that. Can you see the little stalk that looks like a petal kind of coming out? Turns out that's actually where the nectar is. So when a butterfly or something like that lands on this flower, he's going to try to get his proboscis into that little tiny hole there. So basically only things with really long tongues or beaks can get in there. So this is actually a really good hummingbird flower. And if you notice at the edges here, I can't tell the camera quality. Hold on, the fan is blowing it. I can't tell the camera quality here, but if you take a look at the outside here, can you guys see the stamens and the anthers at the end? You can actually even see the, right there. Can you guys see that? I don't know if you can, it's like blurry. Camera quality, oh, awesome, awesome. Yeah, so I don't know if you can see the little like doodle bob at the end of each one of these little pink things or orange things. Those are the anthers, and they're covered in pollen. There's actually one that's not covered in pollen, and that's because that's the stamen. I'm sorry, the carpel. That's where the stigma is located. So it's actually that one. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can't see that, but that's okay. The stamen is there, and the carpel is there. Take my word for it. But that's pretty cool, right? Interesting flower structure. Probably my best and most successful plants in here are the lantanas. So this guy right here, so these are lantana standards. Some of you, if you're gardeners, you might be familiar with lantanas. They're typically annuals, uncommon annuals up here, but they're much more common in Florida and the southern states, although they can be kind of like weeds. And so the lantana inflorescences that we have here, notice that for this particular variety, there are pink flowers and there are yellow flowers. So as it turns out, the pink and yellow flowers represent two different messages to a pollinator. So the butterflies love these. In particular, the longwings love these. So you can see here, this guy is going nuts here on this lantana flower at the moment. He's taking his proboscis and he's sticking it into each one of the yellow flowers. He's going to the pink ones too, but that's actually a mistake. We shouldn't be doing that. Because what winds up happening with this particular variety of lantana is the flowers start out as yellow, and then once they're visited by a pollinator and the nectar is removed from it, they turn pink and then they drop off. They actually go through a natural process of death called senescence. Okay, so it's a programmed senescence, and the flowers essentially drop off at that point. Once they are visited by a pollinator and fertilization is successful, they'll turn into this little cluster of berries here. Now, if you're a gardener and you want your lantanas to bloom constantly, you actually have to go through and remove these berries on a regular basis through a process called deadheading, which essentially just means taking off the dead blossoms and getting rid of them in the fruits, which would stimulate essentially that lantana to bloom again. So another one of my favorite flowers, this is one that the guests absolutely love, are, let me see where, of course, it's not really blooming very much today. Usually this thing is like exploding with flowers. But right here, this is an interesting flower. This is called a caliandra or a powder puff tree. And this again is an inflorescence. There are probably hundreds of flowers there. And this is a relative of the mimosa tree, if you guys are familiar with them, if you've ever had one of those before. And for this particular flower, the swallowtails, which are a larger type of butterfly, absolutely love those. And so this is a swallowtail right here. This is actually an African orchard swallowtail from Kenya and southeastern Africa. Swallowtails are a little bit bigger, and when they fly and they take nectar from flowers, you'll notice that they actually take their top wings and they vibrate them and quiver them to kind of keep themselves level once they visit a flower. And so the reason for that is because they're so large, and they have a difficult time essentially balancing on the flowers once they visit them, much different than something like this. So this guy right here is called a leopard lacewing. And this is a butterfly from Southeast Asia as well. Notice he's got these really cool color patterns all over himself. But he's going to prefer a platform type flower, something like maybe a purple cone flower, echinacea. For instance, that's what they're going to really enjoy. They'll like butterfly bush as well. Butterfly bush has a big spiky flower, but basically something that they can land on and let their entire body sit on it, essentially. like this, essentially. Like here's another longwing. This is a postman from South America, South and Central America, visiting a whole bunch of lantana flowers again. And here's what I meant by the swallowtail, by the way. Now, so here, this is a great Mormon swallowtail. Of course, it stops as soon as I put the camera on him, but so notice his top wings are quivering. And so what he's sitting on right now is an artificial feeder, obviously. These are actually hummingbird feeders with a little sort of like scrubby sponge in them from like the dollar store. Those are filled with orange Gatorade. So yes, believe it or not, they drink Gatorade just like a human would. And they only like the orange Gatorade for some reason. I don't know why. I've tried blue and like lime and stuff like that, but for some reason they really only like the orange. But anyway, so the swallowtail, you can see him sticking his proboscis, that long sort of thing coming out of his head there. You can see him sticking that into the sponge, drinking the Gatorade from the sponge. And in the process, he's trying to keep his balance by quivering his top wings, even though he stopped right now, but he was before. So far, I kind of have shown you a couple of different types of flowers. I've shown you a couple of the different types of butterflies that we have here in the butterfly exhibit. Here's another cool one, by the way. That's called a Chinese paper kite from Southeast Asia. It's a relative of the monarch butterfly. And that's very fitting. It's a nice segue into my next point. So I've talked a lot about these flowers, right? And about pollination. But at the end of the day, I think the takeaway that you should bring from this presentation is that pollination is important, but you can't have one without, you can't have the pollinator, or I'm sorry, the flowers without the pollinator, and vice versa. So when you're designing a habitat for butterflies in your yard or for pollinators in your yard, one of the most important things is to make them happy on every possible level of their biology. So it's nice and it's a good idea, you know, if you can put like flowers that butterflies like in your yard, like lantana or some other perennial. I'll give you some suggestions a little bit later. But if you can put these plants that provide nectar sources to the adults, that's great. But if you want to go a step further and really, really try to keep butterflies, and honestly, even bees and other pollinators happy, what you're going to want to do is give them what they need to live out their life cycle to the full. So for bees, it's a little bit more complicated, and I'll talk about that. It's actually easier for me to show you on the slides than in the presentation here. But for butterflies, let me give you an example of what I mean. So I just mentioned the big Chinese paper kites over here, which are chasing each other around right now. Here's another one right here. So those guys are relative to the monarch butterfly. Does anyone know the name of the plant that monarch butterflies really, really, really like to visit, and they need it in order to survive? Yes, milkweed.
Milkweed.
I see everybody like throwing it. Thank you. Yes, milkweed. And that's exactly what this is right here. Not the milkweed that you might be typically used to seeing, but it is a milkweed. So the Chinese paper kite over here, again, this guy, just to remind you, like the monarch butterfly, is what's called a milkweed butterfly. And what that essentially means is that all the butterflies in that group of butterflies, called the quote-unquote milkweed butterflies, survive as caterpillars on milkweed plants, or plants in the milkweed family. So this gigantic plant right here is a gigantic milkweed tree, it's called. It's actually in the genus Calotropis. This is common in the Central America and the southern United States. We don't really have any of these up here, but the flower is essentially the same. It's just on basically a milkweed flower on steroids. So here's an inflorescence right here. Milkweed flowers look very distinct. And so they almost look like little crowns. That's actually why no, never mind, I'm getting two different anecdotes confused, forget that. But basically they look like little crowns. So this is a milkweed flower right here. Notice nobody really seems very interested in visiting these flowers here in the butterfly exhibit. That's because this particular type of flower, I believe, is more intended for a bee. It's a very complex looking inflorescence and complex individual florets. Regular milkweed flowers, like the ones that you have in your, that you might grow on Long Island, for instance, they are definitely favorites of monarchs and other butterflies, for sure. But this particular type is definitely not. But notice these big, gigantic leaves here. So that's what's important for the milkweed butterflies. So basically, milkweed butterflies, like all other butterflies, need to find their specific host plant in order to lay their eggs. So host plants are essentially those plants that caterpillars or larval insects must feed on in order to carry out their life cycle. So I don't have many host plants in here. This is one of the few that I have. So over here, this one is all chomped up. This is another type of host plant. This is called a pipe vine. Specifically, it's called pelican flower, because it has a big, gigantic sort of flower that looks almost like a pelican, like the big beak of a pelican. This plant over here is called a clerodendron, and this is actually getting chomped by caterpillars that I don't want in here. But again, it is a type of host plant. Now, some butterflies and moths are a little bit more generalist, like they'll feed on a lot of different things, but butterflies like the Chinese paper kite over here can only feed on plants in the milkweed family. And specifically, this one can only feed on a type of vine that grows in Southeast Asia called a milkweed vine. And I actually have some of them, but I'm not going to bother showing you them. They're not very pretty. But if you're designing a butterfly garden, you really need to take that into account when you're designing it, because you want the butterflies to come to your yard and you want them to constantly come back. And if you have a host plant, yes, definitely, Paul. I saw your question. Hold on one second. Let me finish this thought here. So basically, this you're really going to want to have a host plant in here as well, host plants in your garden for the specific butterflies that would occur in your area. It's very important, and people always forget that. And unfortunately, the plants will get destroyed by caterpillars, but so be it. That's what happens. That's their sort of purpose in life. So I hear the music coming on now, so I think we're about to open here. So what I think I'm going to do is show you a few more butterflies here. I'm trying to show you some different ones. Everyone seems to be the same at the moment. Oh, there's a cool one. Hold on one sec. So right down here, this is a really cool one. You guys see that guy? That's called a pink rose, also from Southeast Asia. That's another type of swallowtail, and they're very, very red. And the reason for that is because they're toxic. So most butterflies, especially the ones in here, most of them are pretty much toxic. And that's because of this relationship with their host plant. So this milkweed plant here is poisonous, it's toxic. And those toxins are designed by the plant or are intended by the plant to kill things like caterpillars and other herbivores. But sometimes herbivores get the one up on them, and they wind up essentially taking those poisons into their own physiology and using them for their own defense. And that's honestly what happens with butterflies. That's what makes them so poisonous. Here's another guy. It's a different one. I don't think I've shown you before. That's a Malaysian cruiser. One last point before I head into the butterfly lab and finish up this talk here on some pollinator gardening tips and bees is take a look at this. So this is a fruit tray. We put these out as well because not all butterflies actually like to feed on flowers. Some of them actually like rotting fruit, dead animals, tree sap, and even animal dung and animal waste, believe it or not. So when you're designing a butterfly garden, it's a good idea to provide all of that habitat for them. Okay, so to answer Paul's question, when do you recommend putting feeders out for butterfly? Okay, hold on, there's a bunch of questions. Ooh, sorry. Camera quality. What are the colored bowls they're feeding on? Okay, so I think I answered that one. That's Gatorade with sponges. Why not make a simple red sugar water solution instead of Gatorade with additives? So to be honest with you, the only reason we do that is because Gatorade is easier. That's really the only reason. The additive thing, I'm not sure that there's any sort of credible, there was a comment once in an article in I think the Journal of the Lepidopterist Society, where someone said that using Gatorade as a food source causes crystallization in the gut of a butterfly, but it was not based on any sort of scientific evidence whatsoever. And truthfully, I don't see any negative effects of using Gatorade. I see more negative effects, quite frankly, with using things like oranges, which contain pesticides and toxins very often. And they might be residual on the orange when we put them out. So the Gatorade thing, I don't really worry too much about. But if you were doing this in your yard, not that I would even recommend doing this, quite honestly, because unless you're trying to attract hummingbirds, you know, the Gatorade thing works in here because we have butterflies everywhere. But if in your own yard, chances are you don't have, like, you know, hundreds of butterflies flying around. You're going to wind up attracting things like wasps and like the bad kind of wasps, like yellow jackets and things like that, before you wind up getting butterflies. So if you were to use sugar water in your yard, I would encourage you to do like a hummingbird feeder with the little top on it. That'll keep the wasps out, and it'll only allow hummingbirds and butterflies to visit them. And when do you recommend putting feeders out for butterflies and hummingbirds? So the feeder, so hummingbirds, as I understand, I'm not too familiar with their biology, but I'm pretty sure it's sort of later in the summer that they start appearing. So I would say probably midsummer is when you should put those out. And honestly, the feeder thing, I would probably not even bother doing for butterflies. You're better off getting the right set of nectar plants to attract them in your yard. And then to answer your last question, Paul, do any native insects find their way into the garden? And yes, they absolutely do. The reason that one plant was chomped up before is because I have a caterpillar in here called a cabbage looper. It's a type of moth, and it's a common agricultural pest. And so he's not supposed to be in here, but they wound up finding their way in, and they've been here for like 2 years now, and I can't get rid of them. But we do get praying mantises from time to time. We'll get spiders. We have even cockroaches in here. So it winds up becoming this whole ecosystem. Back when we first opened, we had these gigantic palm trees, which in retrospect was a terrible idea because we don't have a lot of light in here. But they wound up bringing with them gigantic huntsman spiders. They came from a greenhouse in Florida. And in Florida, there's an introduced huntsman spider, which is about probably like that big across, like it's huge. And you'd come in here in the middle of the night with like a headlamp on. You could actually see the shining eyes of a huntsman spider sitting on the wall, waiting to feed on cockroaches, palmetto bugs, basically. And then over the years, it shifted to wolf spiders. And then now I basically don't have any spiders in here now. I have a couple of little house spiders, and that's it. So it's an interesting dynamic, to say the least. But anyway, let me finish up with my presentation, since I think the guests are about to start coming in here. And I'm going to go into the lab. My connection might kind of fizzle out, but I'll be right back, I promise. All right. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay, I'll take that as a no. So let's finish off our little discussion here. Talking about butterfly gardening and some things that you can do in your own gardens to entice not only butterflies, but also bees. So we talked a lot about butterflies out there already. I'm going to recap, kind of go over some of those points again. I'll just breeze through them since I already mentioned them. But what we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about are the bees. And so when we talk about different types of pollinators, again, I hope I conveyed to you that the structure of the flower is super important at determining what type of pollinator best suits it. So I'm going to ask you guys some questions. What do you think is the best pollinator for this particular type of flower? This is digitalis, or foxglove. What do you think is the best pollinator for this type of flower? What do you think his intended pollinator is? Sorry, I'm not sure where the chat is. Hold on. Can I see the chat with the... Oh, there it is. Okay. Wasps. Okay. Good one. Good choice. Possibly hummingbirds. Yeah. So notice how the foxglove flowers are sort of like almost like what's that thing called from Thanksgiving? Oh, cornucopia-ish. You know, like a little, almost like a saxophone-y like vibe coming down. And butterflies certainly are not going to be very good pollinators of this flower. In fact, I don't think butterflies really ever visit these flowers. Flies might go in there and visit them, certainly, because they got a little platform they can crawl up in there. But turns out, I think one of the best pollinators of these guys are bumblebees. So bumblebees can fit their little chubby bodies right up into the flower, and they wind up getting coated in pollen, which I believe is the little anthers. The pollen producing components are up here on the top of the flower. So the bee will stick herself or himself inside of the flower, it's herself really. The bee will stick herself inside of the flower and she'll get dusted with pollen on her back essentially. And when she visits other flowers, she'll wind up going to those as well. This picture here, they're showing you some other things. So here's some unexpected pollinators like ants, for instance. I don't know what that's supposed to be. I think that's a type of true bug. But the main star of the show here is the bumblebee. Bumblebees are definitely one of the best pollinators of digitalis specifically. What about this guy? This is phlox. So think about a phlox inflorescence. It's got a little platform. It's got a long flute coming down. What do you think is the best pollinator for phlox? By the way, there are no really correct answers for this. So just because something's the best pollinator doesn't mean it's the only pollinator. So for those of you who said hummingbird and things like that for foxglove, I'm sure those guys will visit it as well. Basically, any pollinator that can get to that nectar source, that nectary in the inside of the flower, will probably attempt to do so. There are some cases when flowers will actually lace their nectar with toxins that will kill some pollinators or make them sick. And they do this to essentially limit what are called nectar robbers. So basically really, really low quality pollinators that are essentially, they'll come in, they'll take the nectar, but they won't wind up helping the plant out at all. So there's actually flies that will visit the bottom of like even a fox flower or something like this with a long flute at the end of it. The nectar, of course, is at the bottom of the flower. And so there are flies that will go to the bottom of the flower, they'll cut a little hole in it, and then they'll drink the nectar from the flower without ever interacting with the pollen whatsoever. Obviously not a good thing from the flower's perspective. What do you guys think for this one? I'm seeing a lot of interaction here. So I'll give you this one. This one is basically a butterfly, right? So for butterflies, they have that big long proboscis, which they can essentially stick into the little flute of the flower, and they can reach the nectary at the very bottom of the flower. You may have seen flies, for instance, that kind of hover, and they have big, long sort of mouth parts coming out. Those are called hover flies or bee flies. Those guys also will visit flowers like this because they have a long, it's called a hastellum, and they'll be able to reach the bottom of the nectary in that flower as well. What about this guy? Who is the best pollinator of this grass flower? This one I kind of gave you already.
The wind.
The wind, exactly. So notice how this flower, this is a typical grass inflorescence, right? These are the male components sort of dangling down over here, but there's no flare, there's no flashiness about it. In fact, when you first hear about, grass flowers, I think a lot of us may even think like grass has flowers. I don't even think it has a flower. But they do, but they don't need to be flashy. They don't need to be that big Times Square billboard because they're pollinated by the wind. So essentially if you're in the spring, especially if you hit a grass flower when it's producing pollen, it'll essentially the pollen will go flying everywhere and dust everything. So one last one. This is a type of solanum, and I kind of alluded to this before when we were talking about tomatoes. Who's the best pollinator of this? This one actually does have a correct answer. So look at that. So here are, by the way, here are the male components of the flower right here. Notice the pollen is really not like loosely, like if you ever think of like a hibiscus flower, right? Hibiscus, you can look at the flower and you can actually see the pollen just like falling off of it. Or the grass flower, for instance, the pollen is just falling off of it. Here, the pollen is like tightly like packed into those anthers. So as it turns out, bumblebees and other types of bees practice what's called buzz pollination. So buzz pollination is essentially when a bee lands on a flower, it will vibrate its body at the exact resonant frequency of the pollen containing structure. And it does so in such a way that it stimulates the most pollen to be released from that pollen containing structure. They're the only ones that can do that. And the flower essentially knows this, and it knows that they're the best pollinators of this particular type of flower. So it's going to rely on these little guys. Like this is another sweat bee, one of the green, they're called halictids. that can buzz pollinate, because they're the ones that are the best and most efficient at bringing that pollen to another flower. Pretty cool. So tomatoes and potatoes and things like that, by the way, in the greenhouse, in the agricultural industry, greenhouses containing tomatoes are often reliant on bumblebees. So you can actually, as a farmer or a grower, you can actually buy bumblebee colonies and release them into your greenhouse, and they'll pollinate all of your tomatoes for you. Very similarly, honeybees, the Western honeybee, for instance, are often used to pollinate things like orchards and things like that. And farmers will literally take beehives, position them at the periphery of or in the middle of their orchard or their greenhouse or whatever, let the bees do their thing. They'll pollinate for a period of time, they can pack them up, and then they can ship them away. And this is something that happens out west. I think they go from I feel like they go from the Midwest, from the southeast all the way out into California. And there are trucks with beehives on them that essentially will bring these colonies to different sources, to different farmers and growers, let them pollinate for a little bit, and then they bring them and move them on. Pretty cool, but they're clearly very important to us as from a practical standpoint. Now, when we talk about bees being pollinators, I think I kind of already gave you the idea that bees sometimes have behavioral adaptations that allow them to be such good pollinators. So here we have another type of bee. I don't think this is a Western honeybee. I think it's another one. I forget the name of it. The name is escaping me at the moment, but this is an Opuntia flower. This is a cactus. And the little stamens are all sort of doodling around in here in the middle of the flower. They look like little cheese doodles. They are, but bees have really well-developed morphology as well that'll help them to be such good pollinators. So there are two structures called a scopa or scopy and corbiculae, both of which are adaptations that bees have morphologically, so for their bodies, that is, that will allow them to be really good at being pollinators. So the scopa is a broom. So here we have these, they're almost like brushes, like brush pants, but those hairs allow these bees to collect pollen and pack each pollen grain into onto their bodies to help them to carry as much as they possibly can back to their nest or their burrow. A corbiculae is something similar. Corbiculae is basically, as they call it, a pollen basket. It's like a depression in the legs where the bees will essentially pack pollen onto by essentially rubbing their legs against their body, and they pack it nice and tight, and then they can go back to their hive or to their burrow, whatever the case may be, and get as much as possible. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about why they're good pollinators as well. The other thing is, from a behavioral standpoint, is that their life cycle is dependent on pollen. So unlike butterflies, which for the most part don't really feed on pollen, usually butterflies are basically just feeding on flower nectar. Bees very often will rely on not only flower pollen, but also flower nectar. They need that flower pollen specifically for their babies. Flower pollen is extremely nutritious. A pollen grain has the equivalent nutrition of a steak dinner, believe it or not. Nectar, on the other hand, is mostly sugary and it's not really a very nutritious food source. Nectar is good for an adult insect. Adult insects are essentially they don't have a lot of purpose left in their lives. Adult insects, the purpose of them is to simply mate and lay eggs and make as many babies as possible. That's their purpose in life. So nectar, you can think of it as almost like fuel for a really old car. Once that car is done, it's done. It doesn't really need to rely on high quality, nutritious food sources for a long period of time. The babies, on the other hand, are growing and developing. So here we have a sweat bee, and here we have a cross section of one of its nests. And what the sweat bee does is it goes out into the environment, it collects pollen, rolls it into a pollen ball, sticks it in a hole in the ground where it nests, and then its larva, basically its caterpillars more or less, will feed on that pollen grain for the duration of their lives. They'll make a chrysalis inside of this little cell here, just like a butterfly would, and then the adult bee will emerge depending on the species, either later in the season or the following season after the winter. Okay, so pollen is very, very important for these guys. For a honeybee as well, honeybees, when I say honeybee, I mean specifically the Western honeybee. Pollen is really important for their babies as well. So this is a typical honeybee hive up here. You can see these little hexagonal cells. Inside of those hexagonal cells, you have larvae. So here we have the little honeybee larva squiggled up into a little circle. These are all looking very, very healthy. They're at various stages of development. Some of them are getting a little bit older over here. And what winds up happening is the honeybee goes out and it collects pollen. It'll bring that pollen back and it basically feeds it to their babies in each one of these little cells. That's the purpose and the function of a worker bee. So a queen, who's much larger and much fatter, she'll lay an egg, a single egg, into one of these little cells. And these cells are produced by, there's a lot of information here, so forgive me, I'm sort of breezing through it really quickly in order for time's sake, but basically, a queen bee will lay an egg in one of these little cells. That egg will hatch into a larva, and it will develop as the workers feed it pollen over the course of its life, and then eventually it will turn into a chrysalis inside of the cells that it grew up in, essentially. The caterpillar also produces silk, just like a butterfly or moth caterpillar. So it actually spins a little silk cocoon over the top of itself. I don't think there's any cocoons in this picture here, unfortunately, but basically a silk, it almost looks like a half of a golf ball over the top of the cell, and that represents a cocoon. Inside of that cocoon is the pupa. Okay, and I keep calling it loosely a chrysalis, but it's not technically a chrysalis. It's actually a pupa. That's the proper term for it. But then, just like a butterfly, the adult bee will emerge. It'll chew its way out of the little cocoon, and it will pop out and emerge as an adult bee. Now, honeybees are a little bit different. First of all, honeybees are native to Northern Africa. Actually, it's not really known where they're native to specifically, but it's North Africa, Europe, Northern Asia, that kind of area of the world. They're not native to the United States, certainly. So, and that's the Western honeybee that we have around here. When people use them either as rear them as either hobbies or in the agricultural industry, those are technically introduced species. They spend their summers essentially collecting nectar and pollen, and they fill their cells, they fill sort of portions of their hive with nectar mixed with their saliva. They let the water evaporate out until it's the exact viscosity that it needs to be, and then they'll essentially cap it over with wax. That actually is honey. That's with the honey that we eat and we love to put in our food or whatever. That's where that honey comes from. And the purpose of honey is essentially long-term food storage, but it's actually derived from nectar, not so much pollen, even though pollen does get mixed into there as well. In a honeybee hive, they'll actually, when they have an overabundance of pollen, they'll actually collect that pollen, they pack it into these cells. So if you ever look at a beehive, you'll actually see bright yellow, like sort of packed into some of those cells, and that's actually where their pollen sort of surplus is stored in the hive as well. But honeybees are not the best pollinators out there. They're certainly not supposed to be pollinating plants around here in the United States. There are plenty of other native bees. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different types of bees out there in the world. The honeybee is only one species, and there's actually only a few species of honeybees. We call them honeybees because they can produce honey, unsurprisingly, right? Those are the only bees that actually have these, or the most complex, I should say the only bees that have these really complex societies. There are bees that are a little more social than others, like the bumblebees, for instance. Bumblebees will produce sort of semi-social, not quite as complex as honeybees, I guess you could say. And then some of the other smaller bees will sometimes live in little groups or communities as well. But for the most part, a lot of these native bees are solitary. They live on their own, and they don't really practice that gigantic hive. They don't have that hive structure that we're familiar with honeybees. Now, that being said, the native bee population is so much more important than honeybees. You can think of honeybees as, sometimes honeybees can actually be thought of as a problem. Like the practice of beekeeping can actually sometimes cause more harm than good. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But if you look at New York State, for instance, we're thought to have about 400 bee species in New York State. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. So a lot of them, of course, are some of these little like tiny things that we would never even imagine are even bees sometimes. They're small. They're like the size of like baby ants sometimes, or a little bit bigger than that. But believe it or not, 400 native bee species in New York. And there have been a couple of papers that have been published about like how efficient are these native bees as pollinators compared to honeybees. And it's one of the estimates that I came up with. I forgot where I got this from. It was from an ecology paper, I think, said that the activity of about 200 native bee species, so solitary or otherwise, has essentially been equilibrated with the activity of a single honeybee colony. So honeybee colonies are certainly really, really effective pollination sources as well. However, you know, there might be 10,000 or tens of thousands of bees in a really strong hive, but tens of thousands of bees compared to just 200 native bee species, that's pretty impressive for these native bees. So what that's essentially saying is that these native bees often are really highly efficient pollinators as compared to something even like a honeybee, which is more of a generalist pollinator, I would say. So the point here being that a lot of native flowering plant species are dependent on their interactions with some particular species of native bees. And it's, you know, the other thing too is that these bees are much better at being pollinators than humans. So honeybees are definitely better at being pollinators than we are, but native bees are even better than that, because a lot of times they have these specific interactions with these specific morphologies that are able to be far more efficient with their pollination of a particular species. So one of the things that I always like to bring up with this point over here is that, you know, we can try as we might to pollinate artificially. We can take a little brush and brush them along different flowers and things like that and create and sort of artificially pollinate certain plants. But very often the fruits that are born from those those artificially pollinated events are much lower quality than something that a bee would produce. So strawberries are one of the examples that jumps to mind. So like if you let native bees pollinate strawberries, the strawberries are gorgeous and lush and beautiful. If we pollinate it, they're all misshapen and kind of strange. They don't really ripen as well. And the flavor is even not as tasty as a naturally pollinated strawberry. So just something to think about. One of the bees that I think I wanted to kind of call attention to are these little guys over here. So this is a carpenter bee, and carpenter bees have a very specific adaptation. They go out and collect. First of all, they're huge. I don't know if you guys have ever seen carpenter bees before, but they're massive. Those are the big, gigantic bees that are usually hovering around someone's deck or something in the early part of the summer, especially. And what they do is they drill a hole into wood, rotten or soft wood, and they will lay eggs on pollen balls that they've essentially amassed and collected and stuffed into those holes that they've drilled. And then their larvae will grow up inside of these little wooden cells. And the carpenter bees will essentially plug up those holes and allow them to develop on their own. These guys are kind of cute. They're pretty much harmless. You're not going to get stung by one unless you try. So a lot of times people will be scared of carpenter bees because they're huge, obviously, and they'll buzz around you. And they're not trying to attack you. They're just investigating what you're doing. Trust me when I tell you that they will. I actually filmed the video when I was at Comset State Park in Lloyd Harbor. I think it was the last spring. And if you go down to the beach there's these giant like trees or pieces of like wood that they use to line the parking lot by the beach. And there are carpenter bees everywhere. And I stood amongst them, like hundreds of carpenter bees swarming around me, literally hitting into me, but they weren't trying to sting me. So they're not dangerous unless you really, really like provoke them, in which case you kind of deserve to get stung, I guess. But anyway, so the other point I wanted to make is that these native bees are critical to the survival. The habitats of these native bees are critical to their survival. So to kind of compound that point that I made with butterfly gardening. So when you're setting up a butterfly garden, remember I said you want to provide habitat for them. That means you need their host plants, right? So for bees, you know, they may not have host plants per se. They might have plants that they really like over others, but a lot of the times they live in things like rotten logs. They live in the ground. Very, very often they live in the ground. They live in even like a dead branch hanging on a tree or something like that. Like if you think of like a branch that's died and starting to rot away. Some bee species will specifically specialize in that type of habitat. So when you're designing your pollinator garden, you want to make sure that you provide those types of habitats in your pollinator garden. So if you have an area of your yard that you can let go wild and just let the leaf litter fall as it does, you can rake all your leaves over there. Don't throw them away. Just let whatever happens happen. Create like a sandy shaded spot in your yard, whatever the case may be. That would be excellent habitat for a native bee species. The other thing too is, okay, so I kind of did this out of order than what I was expecting. So butterflies are not as good of pollinators as bees and wasps are. But when you're designing your pollinator garden habitat-wise, this is something that you should be shooting for. So on the left-hand side here, and by the way, before I even get into this, when you whatever plants you put in your yard for butterflies will often attract bees as well. So you're essentially serving both purposes when you design a butterfly garden. And don't take that as a bad thing, because bees, like I said, most of these native bees are not going to hurt you at all. They're not going to go out of their way to do any damage to you. Some of them can't even sting. So don't worry if you're like, oh, I don't want to put a butterfly garden in my yard because I don't want to attract bees. Don't worry about it. You won't even know they're there half the time. So just like with the sand sort of pit or the natural area of your yard for the bees, you also want to provide places like a mud puddle or some sort of like drinking area for butterflies. So over here, these are actually Canadian tiger swallowtails drinking out of the mud puddle, and they're getting minerals and things from the soil. And like I said, you want both nectar plants and host plants. And we already kind of talked about this a little bit, but they lay eggs on specific plants. So milkweed is a good host plant, certainly, but everyone loves the monarch, and it's a really popular thing to try to help them. But it's a little annoying sometimes as an entomologist, because the monarch's not the only butterfly out there, and there are plenty of other butterflies that are suffering just as much, if not more, than the monarch butterfly. And the only reason that the monarch is touted so much is simply because it's a nice flagship organism that everyone can sort of rally around. But keep in mind, there are plenty of other butterflies out there. So keeping trees like sassafras, for instance, in your yard. Sassafras is a weedy tree. I happen to like it. I think it's an amazing tree, but it is weedy. It'll grow kind of all over the place. Spice bush swallowtail, that's a common local butterfly, very common local butterfly. They lay eggs on that tree specifically. Or if you have a spice bush in your yard, that's a good alternative. This is a type, this is a buckeye. Up here, buckeye caterpillars will lay eggs on things in the nettle family, and in the snapdragon family. Actually, no, I'm sorry. This is a painted lady. My apologies. This is a painted lady. So the painted ladies lay eggs on things in the mallow family. So if you have any, those are like wildflowers, often weeds that people will pull out of their yard. Again, leave an area of your yard to go wild. Let them live on in that part of your yard, and you can rip the weeds out of another part of your yard. This guy right down here is a cool one. This is called the silver spotted skipper. Skippers are among the sort of probably not the prettiest of butterflies out there. They look almost like moths, but they are butterflies, and they're just as important as pollinators. There's actually a lot of different skipper species out there. There's probably as many as 70 skipper species on Long Island alone. I would not be surprised. These guys lay eggs on black locust. Black locust is a little bit of an iffy case, just because black locust is quite invasive, so I don't know about that one. But keep in mind, if you have a black locust in your yard and you're thinking about taking it out, but you're not kind of on the fence, just leave it until you're ready, because the silver spotted skippers like to lay eggs on that as well. And one of the biggest threats that we have to butterfly and bee habitats, pollinator habitat, is its destruction, its loss, and land development. So farms, shopping centers, or real estate for a retail space. Even vineyards, something like a vineyard out here in the East End, or this is something where I live in Huntington. There's these housing developments crop up literally everywhere, and it seems like every time you turn around, a new little small sliver of wild land has been destroyed and paved down to make way for more of these housing developments. And these are, it's just, you're destroying, like, by removing those wild areas and taking away weeds and things like that, you're removing habitat for pollinators like bees and butterflies. And there's a list. I'm not going to bother going through all of these because I think it's pretty obvious. I think you guys seem like you're pretty savvy, but things like pesticide use, especially on Long Island, you're spraying for ticks or mosquitoes or something like that. Those are damaging to a lot of native and unintended targets, such as bees and butterflies. There are plenty of natural pressures as well, invasive species, competition from invasive species. The honeybee itself can actually compete with native bee species for nectar and pollen sources, all kinds of different things. And beekeeping, while it is it's a double-edged sword. Beekeeping, growing bees is an excellent hobby. It will kind of stimulate learning and interest in the natural world, and it'll also help to pollinate plants, which is important. However, when you start talking about bees, keeping actual beehives in your yard, you're essentially keeping a monoculture that, if it does happen to, propagate disease or other pests, those diseases may transfer over to some native bee species, and it might be, again, an unintended target of our activities. All right, so when you're doing your butterfly garden or your bee and pollinator garden, your goal here is to provide a mix of different plants and specifically nectar plants that are in bloom from the spring all the way through till the end of summer. So there are some good ones here, early bloomers like viburnum or golden chain tree is one that I used to have when I was little. I think that was an awesome nectar source for bees and butterflies alike. Dianthus is another good spring blooming perennial that would be excellent for butterflies and bees, I believe. Then you have some of the ones that we might be a little more familiar with, like echinacea. This is a type of aster called stoichesia. This guy up here, Virginia sweetspire, is an amazing flower, and it has a really nice bark color too. So like in the winter when the leaves all drop off, it has this nice red color to it, and the flower spike is just incredible, and it smells really, really good. I love that one. And then towards the end of the summer, some things like Joe Pyeweed are really, really important pollen and nectar sources for bees essentially that are preparing themselves for the long winter ahead. They're going out trying to collect pollen and store it up to help their hives survive through the winter. And even butterflies like monarchs who are migrating through the area down to Mexico, they can actually stop off at Joe Pyeweed or even goldenrod sources and take some sort of fuel up for the ride, as it were. All right, so basically, a lot of this is stuff that I've mentioned already. One of the other points that I wanted to make too were, preserve for bees in particular. Like I said, most of the plants I just mentioned are good for butterflies, but they're also good for bees. There are some other ones that butterflies don't really seem to like, but bees definitely do. Spirea, for instance, and salvia are definitely better for bees than they are for butterflies. But bees also love flowering trees. So things like witch hazel, cherries, maple, sycamore, any of those are really important early season nectar and pollen sources for bees in particular, because it helps to get there. It helps to give them a strong start for the season. So if you have those in your yard, I know a lot, especially on Long Island, people love their lawns and things like that, but like sacrifice a little bit of your lawn and allow some of these trees to grow on. Even though they create shade, they also create valuable habitat for some of these local bees, these native bee species. Also, just a little bit of manicuring tips here. So like I prefer a much weedier garden. I'm also pretty lazy, so so like the wild look seems to do better for me, and I like it better. And also the pollinators themselves seem to like it better. So manicured gardens, for whatever reason, bees and butterflies both seem to avoid a little bit more frequently. I'm not sure why that is. It's just an observation that I've made over the years. The wilder it is, it seems like the more interested your pollinators seem to be in the garden. And the other thing I wanted to mention too are mulches. So if you don't have to put a mulch down, definitely avoid it. A lot of times they're unnecessary. I think like they're intended to, I think often, either beautify a garden or try to keep down the spread of weeds. But artificial mulches often contain chemical additives that will leach into the soil. They can be taken up by the plants. And frankly, though, I've found that especially landscapers will misuse mulches all the time, and they'll put them down when they don't need to be there, and they cause plants to rot. So for the plants, from the garden perspective, very often they're not a good thing either. Like one of the things that always bothers me is when you go to like a parking lot and you see like trees that are just freshly planted and the mulch is like piled up like a big hill around the roots. That's like the worst thing you could possibly do for the tree. I know that I think the intention is to give it nutrition, but it's really either starving, it's either causing a saturated environment for their roots, or keeping water from actually interacting with the roots. It's actually letting it run off to the side, which is not good either. But anyway, one thing for bees that I think is really fun to do, it's an activity that's really, really kind of fun for families, is creating these sort of carpenter bee habitats. Because what this will do, and basically what these are, you can actually buy these in stores. Like we actually have them in the gift shop here at the aquarium. And these are essentially little bamboo shoots rolled into this little sheet. And what will happen is mason bees and carpenter bees will see this and they'll be like, oh, look at that. It's like a pre-drilled hole for me. This is more for mason bees over here because the little flutes are shorter, but they'll come in, they'll lay their eggs, they'll collect pollen, they'll stick the pollen in there, and then they'll sort of pack up the holes. And that's a really excellent activity for the family just to watch these guys do this, because it is really cool. And if you put it away from your yard, that'll hopefully kind of lure some of these bees away from your own house. So like a lot of times carpenter bees, for instance, are looked at as a pest because they'll dig holes in your deck or in the sides of your house or something like that. And they're not going to, trust me, they're not going to destroy your house like a termite would. So you really shouldn't be too concerned, although I can understand why people would want giant holes in their home. But again, if you give them an alternative in your yard, again, in that wild area in your yard, they'll kind of be more drawn to that than they would your house. And then talking about butterflies, so like another cool learning experience for like a family is to raise caterpillars and raise butterflies. But when you include host plants in your yard, I would encourage you to kind of leave them alone. A lot of times people will see these caterpillars in their yard and I guess will feel compelled to protect them and to help them along, which is fine if you know what you're doing. Don't take that to mean an offense, because you wind up actually hurting them more than you realize by bringing them indoors. So you might cause them to get disease more easily, or in the worst case, one of the things that we have all the time at the aquarium here are calls in the middle of winter about black swallowtails. So black swallowtails feed on parsley, fennel, rue, anything in that sort of herb family. And people will take these caterpillars in at the end of the season because it gets cold. I understand, you feel bad, whatever. But then the caterpillar thinks, I am inside now and it's really warm. I can probably emerge again as a butterfly. And you'll wind up getting butterflies emerging in the middle of February, like right now. And they're going to die because there's nothing for them to feed on. You can't release them in the yard because it's too cold. And if you had just left them, they probably would have made a chrysalis in a few days or so. And they probably would have been fine. They would have been better off outside. So I encourage you to especially a group like this, because you guys are probably more nature inclined than some other people out there. I would encourage you, if you're looking to raise caterpillars and do like one of these activities with your family, just research before you go out and do it, just so you make sure you're doing the best thing possible and you're prepared for that caterpillar when the time comes. And then of course, there's a list of other different things that you can do to help pollinators in your area. One of the things being that, show up at town meetings and things like that, be involved in local politics, because very often some of these people are the ones that are in control of the destiny of these habitats for local pollinators. So something as simple as trying to cut down on mowing, or choosing the timing of mowing around roadways and things like that, are probably going to do a lot more good than you would think. So very often, municipalities, they're going to want to mow all the weeds and things around off the sides of roadways. But if you do mowing at certain times of the year, such as in the late fall, perhaps, that might be a little bit better than mowing in the spring when pollinators are getting their start and kind of going out and doing their thing. Or you can have some of these lawmakers essentially avoid mowing altogether, which would be even better. Alternatively, you can have towns try to essentially, when they're designing their, beautifying their towns with gardens and plant material, you can actually have them just slightly choose their plant choices a little bit better. Have them choose pollinator-friendly plant material as opposed to just green things that aren't really going to help pollinators in any way. So this is something that I actually was involved in what's the name of the town? Not Glen, it's out west somewhere. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name of the town that I did this in. It was out west on the island somewhere, out by Glen Cove. And we were basically trying to talk to local lawmakers, and we essentially said, like, hey, you buy all these different annuals every single year to put in your on the islands and roadways around parking lots, things like that. Why don't you just use this set of plants instead? And they were pretty receptive to it. They have a lot of these people don't want to hurt pollinators, and they simply just don't know what to do in their best interest. So last but not least, be a citizen scientist and help the experts. So there are a lot of different ways that you can become involved in citizen science and with regulating and tracking pollinators, one of which being Monarch Watch. This is a very popular thing to do where you essentially will, they have these big sort of like bio blitzes where you go with like a local scientist, you catch monarchs, and then you bring them, you basically put like a little sticker on them, and that helps to keep track of the this individual as it flies from wherever we are up here in the Northeast down into Mexico. And the same can be said for things like bumblebees. So the Bee Blitz program, for instance, this is operated through the Bee Conservancy and the Bumblebee Watch. Both of these guys are involved in essentially having you as just homeowners check your backyards, try to identify some local and native bees, and then essentially record them in this database, which will then allow scientists to say, okay, I guess, you know, the longhorn bee is actually still on Long Island and it's actually doing much better in recent years as a result of X, Y, and Z or whatever. All right, so those are some sources that you guys can visit if you feel so inclined. If you want to take a look at some plant lists for butterfly and bee gardening, Cornell Cooperative Extension has a couple of really nice sources that you can literally just look up butterfly gardening, Cornell Cooperative Extension, and they have like a little pamphlet that comes up. And of course, if you have any questions for me, you can always go ahead and email me at either my aquarium email or the Cold Spring Harbor email. I would probably use the Cold Spring Harbor email just because this one I don't really check very often. And that's it. That's pretty much it. Does anyone have any questions at all? I think we lost a lot of people, but I went over a little bit more. Email the websites. Yes, I can email the websites. Yeah, I'll email you guys I can email you the websites, and I actually have a butterfly gardening guide that we give out here at the aquarium that I can email to Paul, and he can send that to y'all, and you can peruse that at your leisure.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. That was fabulous.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Absolutely. I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than I would.
No, it was great. So you're now in the aquarium in Riverhead?
Yes.
That's where the butterfly garden is? I didn't know that existed there.
Oh, yeah. So we have so the aquarium has we have a butterfly section. We have an insect zoo as well. And there's also we're actually going to be doing like a crab, exhibit, I guess you could call it, within the next few months. So we have like this little wing of the aquarium all to ourselves over here.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. And we're open.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. Well, I wanted to note, we're open all year round as well at the aquarium and the butterfly thing. A lot of people think we close down. Like Sweetbriar Nature Center has a really nice butterfly house as well. They're only open during the summer, however. And both of them are really good. I think you guys should visit both just to check out what's there. Alrighty, guys. Well, if there are no other questions, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Alrighty, guys. Have a wonderful day, okay?
Bye-bye.
Thank you. You too. Bye.